Okay.
Okay, I'm back again. Ronelle Delmont with Stephen Monier. We switched sides, and I'm at a different location outside of the house. And Steve was talking about his Trojan horse experience as a U.S. Marshal. But Steve, you were retired as the police chief of Goffstown, New Hampshire. When you, as a retiree, you became a U.S. Marshal for what, 7 years, you said?
7.5 years, I served as a U.S. Marshal for the District of New Hampshire. So that's a presidentially appointed position. President George W. Bush appointed me in 2002. I was confirmed by the Senate in May, and I started on May 22nd, I believe it was, May 20th, somewhere in that range. And then I served for 7.5 years as the U.S. Marshal for the District of New Hampshire. And the Marshal
You were a
Service.
retired police chief and
Right.
retired uh, U.S. Marshal.
Yes, now I'm fully retired. So,
Now you fully accept you take care of your dog.
and I like to write. So my latest book, which just came out, is called "No One Has to Die: Inside the Longest Armed Standoff in the History of the U.S. Marshal Service," which occurred right here in Plainfield, New Hampshire, in 2007 during my tenure as Marshal. Now, fortunately. Um, This did not end like Waco and Ruby Ridge,
Thank
which is
you.
what the Browns, who were tax evaders, and he was head of the U.S. Constitution Rangers, a militia group. Um, they were threatening that if we went there to arrest them for their convictions for serious felony tax evasion charges, that there would be another Waco in the hills of Plainfield, New Hampshire. But we were determined not to let that happen. Fortunately, we had a good team in place of Chief Deputy U.S. Marshals and Deputy U.S. Marshals, and um, after a 266-day armed standoff with the militia members and the Browns, we were able to successfully conduct a ruse to safely take them into custody without a shot being fired.
And I know your ruse because I bought the Kindle version after reading all the newspaper accounts that I could get my hands on, and I bought the Kindle just earlier today. I haven't read your whole book, but it's an incredible story how you duped them into believing you had been. Was it you yourself who was that guy D
No.
or G or something? It was not
No, so the deputy, because New Hampshire is a small state, and the Browns knew both me and Gary DiMartino, my chief deputy, and several of the deputies on our staff. There were only in We were one of the smaller districts in the country. There was only 11 or 12 of us sworn, including myself, and then we had 5 or 6 support staff in the office. Now, some districts are quite large, like
right.
the District of Massachusetts, where you have several hundred deputies.
Wow.
We were one of the smaller ones. So we had to bring in outside help. So, no, Gary and I knew the Browns because we had arrested them the first time in 2006 after they were indicted by the federal grand jury on the income tax charges. And in fact, we conducted a ruse then to get them away from their heavily fortified home and down to the dental office where we had deputies pretending to be
Hey,
public works and
oh,
water works people. And we duped them into believing there was a water leak at their dental office and they had to come down there. So we arrested them the first time on a ruse. And on the second time, after the long standoff, we brought in Deputy U.S. Marshals from our Atlanta Task Force, the Regional Fugitive Task Force in the Atlanta area. Um, and they were the undercover deputies that went in and actually made the arrests. Um, and they were duped into believing that these deputies were like-minded supporters who were coming to Plainfield as others had at the Browns' invitation to support them in their cause against in their words, the evil federal government.
well, but they were in belief. they believe some of the marshals had the same viewpoint as
That's right. Yeah,
same
that was
ideological.
that's what the ruse was, that these were militia guys from Georgia who were
Yeah.
coming up to support them in their cause.
Usually those people are in Idaho. What are they doing in New Hampshire? I've always heard of
So,
that
you know,
belief.
the other, yeah, well, the other big case that they often talked about, besides threatening that this would end up like Waco, was Ruby Ridge. Now,
Right,
Ruby Ridge in Naples, Idaho, and
right.
that was a standoff in 1992 that lasted 11 days, and unfortunately, during those encounters, a highly decorated deputy U.S. Marshal was shot and killed, as was Randy Weaver's son, and then
Yeah.
ultimately his wife,
I,
who was shot by an FBI sniper. Um, and that was a very tragic incident. Again, a standoff with armed people in the hills of Idaho, Ruby Ridge. A year later, in 1993, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, ATF, attempted to serve warrants on a compound belonging to the Branch Davidian sect, and David Koresh was their leader in Waco, Texas, just outside of Waco, Texas. And that was a standoff that lasted 51 days and involved hundreds of FBI and ATF agents and members of the U.S. Armed Forces, and ultimately ended up where um, uh, 76 Branch Davidians, including 25 children, and David Koresh died in a fire when the FBI attempted to insert tear gas into the compound. In the initial gun battle, 4 ATF agents were killed and 16 were wounded.
wow,
So a lot of people died in that
a
in
lot of
that in
people.
that tragedy, and this is what the Browns and their supporters were threatening to do in the hills of Plainfield, New Hampshire, of the live free or die state of New Hampshire, and we were determined not
Not to let
to
the
let that happen. So
was
it
the
took nine
one.
months. It
Yeah.
took 9 months. You'll have to read the book about how
Yeah.
we got there and all the steps we had to go through and all the trials and tribulations and sleepless nights. Um, but that's what prompted me once I finally retired from public sector work to write the book.
Mm. It's very disturbing. As I was saying at the end of the first part that we did, I read a lot about Henry Ford because he was a friend of Charles Lindbergh's, and
Yeah.
his secretary was William Cameron, who was the founder, along with a guy named Howard Rand. I forget his name, who continued the British Israelism idea of the mid 19th century that the it came to be known. It's Christian identity is what the legacy of Christian identity, which are these groups that uh, they're all a little different. They have different attitudes. Probably I haven't studied them that greatly, but the reason I'm bringing it up is because when I started the website based on your book, because your book, you and Gregory Ahlgren wrote this incredible book that just blew me away because I worshiped Lindbergh as a child, and uh, that was a stupid movie they made with Jimmy Stewart was in his mid 40s when he played a 24-year-old airmail pilot. But and I loved Lindbergh, and you and Gregory destroyed my childhood mythology about him, but it made so much sense. I just had to give up thinking that my hero was perfect and that you were probably right. Something was wrong. And it led me to make the website. Okay, so I made the website and I began hearing from a lot of white supremacists, neo-Nazi people, and I got anti-Semitic literature, not liter. I got anti-Semitic emails, and it was
Yes.
very disturbing to me that I have to tell you, they love Charles Lindbergh. They love him, and
Well,
I
they
never.
did. You know, and it was, yeah, I did a lot of the historical research while Greg focused on the trial of Hoffman and some other the evidentiary
Mm,
pieces to the whole case involving the so-called kidnapping. But Charles Lindbergh, he was given a medal by Hermann Göring that he never returned
right.
to the Nazis and never disavowed them. In fact, he was part of the America First movement of that
Mhm.
time when FDR was president and strongly led the charge to stay out of the war in Europe at the time
Right.
against the Nazis, and he came to believe that the Nazis couldn't be defeated, particularly with their air capabilities. And of course, once Pearl Harbor happened and we did get into World War II, his views didn't change much, frankly. And as I said, he never gave back the medal that Hermann
He
Göring
gave up his
him.
uniform, but he didn't give back the medal. This is the thing that people do not
Well,
recognize.
so
He gave up
well,
his uniform to make those speeches.
right,
Didn't
and he
make them as.
knew.
Mhm. Go
Well,
ahead.
once the war did start and we declared war against both Japan and Germany, because they declared war on us, he did try and rejoin the military, but FDR was so
Right.
upset with him, he wouldn't allow it.
Right.
And so he ended up flying as a civilian pilot, as a test pilot for some of the manufacturers.
It's totally
Who,
illegal. He should have been locked up for that. That what he was a citizen
well, there were a
flying.
lot, it was a strong movement. The America First movement was a strong movement to stay out of more European wars because of our
Right.
experience in World War One.
Right.
Not everybody involved in that movement was anti-Semitic, but
Absolutely.
a lot of Lindbergh's buddies were, and Lindbergh was anti-Semitic. So,
But
um,
that's not, excuse me, that's not what I meant. He was
yeah,
flying missions in the
yes,
Pacific, he was a citizen. He was not a military personnel. He just showed up at that
right,
place,
yes, that's right. He
I
did.
forgot what island it was, and he was flying. He claimed to, and they say he shot down Japanese pilot. He had no business engaging. It was illegal. I don't know if I'm using the right word, but it's against military authority to let citizens go up in planes and shoot down the enemy. Is that well? You
Well,
know what I'm saying? Like, what do you think about that? He didn't have a uniform, but
he was not in uniform, but he was a test pilot. But here's another example, Ronelle. You're right. They let him do this. Now,
right,
when I say they, the people who hired him, and these were people, the companies that were manufacturing planes for the war
right,
effort, and
right.
he was hired as a test pilot, right? But he went there, and people again deferred to him, much like they deferred to
Exactly.
him during the kidnapping on that happened in 1932 at the Hopewell home in New Jersey, where you're showing the picture of the ladder against the nursery window.
Yeah.
Um, so he was still a very famous person, and in 1932, especially when the kidnapping was alleged to have occurred. That evening when the baby disappeared, he was the most famous man in the world. There was no
Right.
doubt,
Right.
you know.
Right. It took a lot of guts to write your book. I was blown away. I thought you and Gregory, I'll never forget how I found out about the book. It was 1994 and OJ was on trial and the words
Yes.
trial of the century was everywhere. And I put in trial of the century in a computer and out popped your book. And I said, what? Lindbergh, Lindbergh kidnapped his own baby. I could not believe it, but I bought the book and I read it, and then you convinced me. It's interesting how resistant I was to the idea, thinking, oh, two guys in New Hampshire, the crackpots. But I read the book anyway, and you made your case so beautifully that people have argued with me over the years that you don't have footnotes and you don't have say. I mean, uh, you know.
So we
I
had
have,
a yeah. So yeah.
it's
There are
such a
some
great,
valid criticisms of our book in terms of the having a good editor and having a
Right.
publisher that was a little more sophisticated than, although this our publisher out of Boston at the time, Brandon Press, had been around for a long time, but there are valid criticisms in terms of the footnotes and
But
bibliography.
not of the theory, not of, I
But
mean,
but
people
but you're
still,
right. The meat and potatoes are there.
yes, I agree. It's just a um, beautiful. It's a very brave argument to make when it's just brave that nobody had written. Noel Bain came out with a book at the same time, and I
Yes.
spoke with him on the phone. He died later, but his book points to Lindbergh only as a cover-up artist who's covering up for his sister-in-law, who was the real murderer. And but you and Gregory, I you started a revolution, and people are not giving you enough credit for that because now everybody looks at Lindbergh. They've delved into his background as you did, but they've found other skeletons like his eugenics. I don't know if you bring up the eugenics in your book. I forgot.
Greg
Did-
touches on that in the book, and yes, we did bring it up. And the other thing that's come out about Lindbergh, of course, is that he had two other families in Germany.
Three,
Yeah, he's yes,
three,
and three,
seven
and he
children. There are
yeah,
three
and
women in.
sired a number of children with other women while he was married to Anne Morrow Lindbergh. So we had come across hints of that while we were doing our research, but
Oh,
we couldn't substantiate it, so we didn't put it in the book. But it came out not too long afterwards, and
hints about the other families or hints
about the
about,
other families. Yes, yeah,
oh,
yeah. We
because
we had gotten some information talking to some people during our research that. He was a polygamist and had families over in Europe.
you
And
heard that in 93 when your book was being
we
published.
did, yes.
Wow.
But we didn't put it in the book because we didn't
Right.
have enough even circumstantial evidence to say that. And of course, um, Reeve Lindbergh was living, I believe, in Vermont at the time. And when our book came out, she denounced the book, of course, but didn't say too much more about it. And um, So, he was a very complex individual to say the least, Charles Lindbergh.
Yeah, very.
And at the end of my research into it, I had the same when I started this, Ronelle, same outlook that you did. That he's the first one to fly across the ocean solo, a heroic effort and worthy of praise. And but at the end of by the time our book came out, I didn't like him very much.
No. The
So
gasoline that he fed to the kerosene
right,
he,
one of his
yes.
co pilots that he roomed with, he put gasoline. His
Yeah.
roommate Lindbergh was kind of a loner. He didn't have a lot of friends, didn't go out much. But his roommate at the time, who was a fellow pilot for the airmail runs, he would go out and he was a bachelor. He'd go to bars. Then he'd have drinks. He'd come back and he always kept a pitcher of water next to his bed before he went to sleep. He'd drink from it. Well, Lindbergh thought it was great fun. He replaced all the water with gasoline.
Right.
And his buddy, so-called
Almost
buddy,
died.
ended up going to the hospital.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that was just one of his jokes, or
Yeah.
so-called.
Bud Gurney never forgave him until the kidnapping, by the way. I researched all of this a lot, and uh, I don't want to take up your time to talk about my experiences. I want to hear about yours, but uh, he, no, what was I saying?
He didn't forgive him, Bud
He
Gurney. I
never,
don't.
right. He, in fact, Bud Gurney was interviewed in 29 when 27 to 28, somewhere. Uh, he said terrible things about Charles Lindbergh. Terrible. He hated him and they didn't speak for a long time. Right before Lindbergh passes away in 74, about a year earlier, Lindbergh flies out to California and tapes an interview that he does with Bud Gurney. And it's my belief he was just trying to make sure that Bud Gurney doesn't say anything inappropriate about him, because they did become friends later after the kidnapping. That's the point. People began feeling so sorry for Charles Lindbergh, and he didn't deserve that kind of respect when he was waiting 2 hours while the envelope is supposedly on a windowsill. His baby is gone. The kid could be in Connecticut by then. Oh, but he doesn't open the envelope. He's not a father who's looking for his child. And he got so much sympathy that people forgave him for the worst. I mean, Bud Gurney almost died from the kerosene, and
Yeah.
everybody wanted a thing. And you bring that out perfectly in your book
Well,
about,
as I said earlier, Ronelle, I come from the viewpoint that the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior.
yeah,
He had already by 1932, he had a number of instances like that of his behavior towards other people, including his wife Anne, who
oh,
he embarrassed many times during their social outings with other friends.
yeah, he mopped the floor with her. That's the way I look at their marriage. He mopped the floor. She was, and for someone, it's unusual. Maybe it's not unusual. She lived in a 40-room mansion. She had powerful parents.
Yes.
Her father was so powerful as a partner with J.P. Morgan, an ambassador, senator, and yet she ran off with this. But the myth,
The legend.
the legend, yes, she married a legend. And
Yeah. Yeah.
has Reeve ever contacted you about any of the things?
No.
No,
No, she never contacted. The only comment she ever made was when our book first came out, and
you did make a
I think
comment.
it was the AP reached out to her to get a statement about it, and
Mm.
she just said no, it's not true, and
Well,
you
it
know,
must be difficult. She was the youngest daughter. She didn't
right,
even know
exactly,
she
of
had a
course,
dead brother. Yeah,
yeah, of course, difficult, and so we didn't try and reach out to her. She was not one of the ones we tried to interview. So.
right. Well, the seven children in Germany didn't come out. They knew about their origins, but they waited until Anne Morrow died.
Right.
And
Before
they
that
would,
came out. Yes.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
nobody wanted to upset Anne. So, uh,
Any further.
no,
A
she
lot of
had
people felt
enough.
she had had enough. Right. Yeah.
Right.
But
So nothing about your research has changed. Is there anything you would have put in the book now that you left out, or
well, so one of the things we discussed is there is an effort to try and do some DNA testing on the envelopes, and in my view, the one they ought to test first is the one Lindbergh claimed to find on the windowsill, the
Mhm.
first one. Because if it's his DNA on there, then that certainly substantiates our theory far more.
Right. But
Hoffman was electrocuted because he was convicted not only of the kidnapping but of the death of the child, and but we believe he was just somebody caught up in one of the several attempts to get ransom money out of this case.
are you aware, all these years of people trying to prove, a guy named Kelvin Correga? I have his whole 40-page report on my website. You could read it anytime. Keraga is his last name. And he did a very intensive study of the wood. Mark Falzini at the archive, which, by the way, is closed now. You can't even go to study anything there. Uh, Mark Falzini allowed him to outwardly take photos, make measurements, nothing invasive. And his report, which I've read many times, it's difficult reading for someone like myself. He claims to prove that the board in the attic floor was once part of the side rail. And I cannot believe that. I just cannot. And I want the forensic testing to be done on that ladder as much as I want the nursery notes to be done. because that's the only way they got Hauptmann into New Jersey to even put him on trial for the kidnapping. So I don't know what you think about the wood. How, if the wood does match, can you think of a way in which Hauptmann is still innocent? uh,
Well,
it's not,
so here's um, if the wood does match. That's a big if. I don't know enough about DNA testing of wood, but
it
I
can
can
be
say,
done. No, I
but
researched be done.
it can be done.
Yeah, yeah, because it was a living organism, a tree, and
Right, and that makes sense. But without that and not knowing that, it makes no sense that here's a guy who's a carpenter, correct? He has all sorts of wood in his garage that's
right,
left from projects he's worked on. He lives near a lumber yard in the
lumberyard.
Bronx, and yet you're going to convince me that he makes a ladder out of wood he has to go up in his attic and cut floorboards out to make a ladder. It just makes no sense.
No,
And that's that's what Greg and I concluded when we looked at that. Plus, the grains from the photographs we saw from the we didn't photograph the ladder ourselves, but we saw the photographs and they're extensive from the New Jersey State Police, and
right.
it just doesn't make any sense. They don't look like they match, but again, if there's DNA testing done on the ladder and that's allowed, and it shows it came from his attic, well, it shows he might have been complicit in something to do with crawling up the ladder that night, but that still doesn't prove he was the one on the ladder. Far more important is the DNA on that first
Envelope.
envelope.
Well,
Because if it's
yeah,
just Lindbergh's, then Lindbergh wrote that.
right. Right. There's also the possibility that I brought up in one of my videos, because I was in the antiques business. I'm familiar with a lot of accoutrement that people had on their desks. Even poor people, rich people, all kinds of people would have a little round cup that it was made especially to fit a sponge.
Right.
And the sponge was in a little bit of water, and they would just drape the flap of the envelope or the stamp over the sponge and then fix it to the paper. So there's a possibility, because it is 1930, 32. People still had those kinds of things, especially wealthy people. Um, I don't know. So there may be nothing.
There may be nothing. And so,
I don't know what the
it
state
may or
will
may
do.
not, it may or may not resolve all the
Right.
outstanding questions, and there are many, but it on the other hand, it may. So we won't know unless they allow it. And right now, apparently that's up to the court.
Well, you're in law enforcement your entire life. Why? What do you think is behind the stonewalling? I begged them in 2001 to do the testing. I got an answer no. People were, I guess, in the 90s thinking about it. What do you think is the problem there in New Jersey? Is it a Jersey problem versus a New Hampshire problem? What do you think?
Yeah, I can't answer that, Ronelle. I
Nobody.
don't really know other than that they don't, the case has been closed.
But
They
do you
stand,
think they know Bornman was living in the house, for 2 months?
right.
So what kind of an officer or in law enforcement in the year 2025 has worries in their head about something that happened almost 100 years ago? What would is it? I believe it's that they feel they would owe Manfred, who's in his 90s, $1 trillion. And as long as he's alive, they'd never. This is I can't imagine what other reason they would have to
I don't know.
stop.
I'd be speculating to
Right.
say, and I don't know who's actually making that decision.
Nobody does.
Is it the superintendent of the New Jersey State Police, or is it coming from the governor's office? I don't know that. Um,
No, and they don't want us to know.
well, and apparently they don't want to have the testing done. So, Part of the argument might be, even though there are minimally invasive techniques now, with DNA testing has come so far since
Right.
since it originated in the 80s, to what they can do now with it, that it's unbelievable, really. It's like science fiction stuff.
It is. They can
And
determine the family even though they don't have the name of the person.
correct, correct. And so. Yeah, but I can't answer for you what
I
the
know.
reason
By
that
the
they're
way,
opposing that.
your brief is up on my website. I put your
Yes.
wonderful brief and Gregory's brief. It's all part of, and the whole 200-page lawsuit is there for anybody to read. We're running out of time again.
So,
What do you want to say about your books? Both of them. Are you going to write a
oh,
third one?
well,
You got another story to tell us?
I do
You
have
do?
some other stories to tell, and hopefully I'll have the time now that I'm fully retired. One thing that was a big advantage to me in writing my most recent book is that I was retired and I had more time and to do more research and when Greg and I wrote Crime of the Century, we were both working full
Working full
time and
time.
we were fathers and husbands. And I wrote my chapters pretty much in the middle of the night while my wife and kids were sleeping. And then of course, I was a busy police chief and Greg was a busy criminal defense attorney. So we had a
Busy in Goffstown, there's that much crime?
Well, no. Actually, New Hampshire is one of the safest states in the nation, but that doesn't mean there's no crime. It
Right,
just means we have a lot less of it than anybody else. But we
right,
have, you name the crime, it happens in New Hampshire too,
right. You know what else you
but
have in
just
New
to a lesser degree.
a lesser degree.
Yeah.
You know what else you have in New Hampshire? Lindbergh's crate was made into a museum or a cottage. Do you know about it? Because I
No,
emailed Gregory about it a while back, thinking maybe that's where Lindbergh got the lumber to make the ladder. The crate that the Spirit of St. Louis was packed up in,
ah,
and when what's his name came over on the ship with Lindbergh, what was the name of that ship? They brought him over in a military ship because they
right. Yes, Navy.
militarized a civilian pilot. They made him part of the, you know that whole story. But
Yeah,
the British created his ship, his Spirit of Saint
plane.
Louis,
Yeah.
took it apart, put it in a box. He never forgave them, and maybe that would. So it's in New Hampshire. It became a museum, but somebody was living in it. Lindbergh I forgot the story. You could look it up. You didn't know that it was in New Hampshire?
I didn't know that. That's
Yeah.
not something I ran across, where the crate that the plane was packed up in
Yeah,
ended
but
up. Yeah.
who
Well,
knows?
New Hampshire is a beautiful state.
Oh, yeah.
It's called the live free or die state after General John Stark from the Revolutionary War. The people in the state are proud of that motto. And but it's also a very safe state. But yes, there's lots to do when you're a police chief in a small community in New Hampshire, just like there's lots to do if you're a police chief in a big city.
Right.
It's just the volume of work is different, but
So
everything
what's
is the same.
so the next story is going to be a U.S. Marshal story or a
I'm
new,
going to stick with U.S. Marshal stories, and I'm thinking of trying my hand for the first time instead of writing a nonfiction, of writing fiction, loosely based on some famous U.S. Marshal Service cases.
like Bat Masterson and Wyatt Earp?
Wyatt Earp. In fact,
They were both
the
U.S. Marshals.
assistant director of the U.S. Marshal Service, who helped us a lot and worked out of headquarters during this case, his name was Mike Earp, and he is a descendant of Wyatt Earp.
Sure.
Yeah, and he's now retired, but he was a big help to us out of headquarters during this
Yeah, the
case.
OK Corral.
Yeah,
The
yeah.
OK Corral. So you had your
Lots of
own OK.
history and lots of history with the Marshal Service.
I know. But Bat Masterson was quite a flamboyant character,
Yes,
gambler and whatever. I think there was a television series about him. Oh,
there
well,
was.
so Yeah, so you've got more stories up your
We
sleeve,
got more stories, yes.
and I hope you'll continue to engage in the crusade to get New Jersey to grant permission for those
We'll
outlaws.
see what the court does. The brief that I'm sorry, I'm forgetting his name, but the attorney
Yeah,
who,
Perhatch. It's an
yeah,
unusual name.
correct.
Kurt,
Yeah,
Kurt. Yeah.
that's a well-written brief, and hopefully the court
You read
will.
the brief, the 200 pages. It's fascinating.
It is fascinating, yes, and I thought it was well done. So did Greg.
Yeah, there's a forensic scientist who works on mummies. Did you read
Yeah, and
her?
they're willing. So the people are lined up who are willing to
Yeah,
do the minimally invasive DNA testing. So
right. And
hopefully the
all the
court will see it.
people who've written other books with completely different theories, people who hate your theory,
Right.
is
Yes.
nobody who can say no, no DNA. What person? Whether this bothers me that people get into factions and camps and they don't like this theory, so they don't talk to that one. But we're all on the same level in regarding the necessity to have some forensic proof because none of us have it. The
Right.
cremation destroyed everything, not everything, but and as you know, the Lindbergh family took out all the DNA from the museum. You know about that, right? In
I, I,
2004, they got a court order and made the archivist give them back the T-shirt, the sleeping
right.
hair, the
Yes. The
bones.
sleeping suit. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and that was only because the Germany, the children in Europe were claiming to be siblings of the Darien, Connecticut children. So, yeah. So, okay. Well, let's hope
Well,
we'll.
let's hope it goes that way. And
Yeah.
I see your time is going to run out here
Yeah.
very
It
quickly.
is.
But
So,
thank you for taking the time, Ronelle, and
thanks.
bringing attention to that case, and also letting me talk about my latest
Oh,
book.
I can't wait to read it. Yeah. I just
Let
got.
me know what you think.
I
I'd be
will.
interested.
I will.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Steve.
All
Yeah.
right, Ronelle.
Bye.
Thank you. It's great talking with you.
Take care.
All
Bye.
right. Bye-bye.
Bye. Oh.